Good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to announce Dr. Ziska. He will give a webinar on the impact of climate change on pest management. Dr. Ziska, he is a specialist on climate change and impact on weed science and other aspects of crop production and health. He has a large experience on climate change. He worked on the International Rice Research Institute. He worked for several years in the USDA, and now he's working in Columbia University. Thank you, Dr. Ziska, to accepting our invitation. I'm looking forward to hear you, and I will handle the screen to you.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm hoping that you will get a sense of what's going on in regards to climate change and food security through the lens of pest management. So without further ado, let me go ahead and get started. When you start looking at global CO2 emissions, this is sort of a very complex atlas of carbon dioxide, but I just wanted to point out the sort of two main issues. Here, the United States and China are the primary contributors of carbon dioxide for global warming. If you look at the historical context of how much carbon dioxide there has been in the air, you will see, based on air trapped within ice cores, that the sudden increase that we're currently seeing is unprecedented in terms of recent geological history. If you ask the question, well, why does this matter? Whether the carbon dioxide levels are 300 or 400 or 500 parts per million, there are sort of two contexts in which to appraise that. The first one has to do with, I'm sure, an issue that you've all heard about, and that is that we know that carbon dioxide can contribute to warmer surface temperatures. If you look at the various constituents of the atmosphere, you'll see that nitrogen and oxygen and argon are the primary components. I will only point out that there are two particular gases that are important: carbon dioxide and water vapor. And these are considered to be global warming gases. Now, what do I mean when I say a global warming gas? Well, in essence, what these gases do is they resonate, or they absorb energy in the infrared part of the spectrum, the heat part of the spectrum. So whenever heat comes into contact with these molecules, they resonate. They will absorb some of that energy that would otherwise be lost to space. And this is not a bad thing. This is what we consider to be a natural greenhouse effect that allows us to have temperatures on the surface of the Earth that permit life as we know it. So if there were no carbon dioxide, if there was no water vapor in the air, the surface temperature of the Earth would be about -18 degrees Celsius. You would be very cold. But with water vapor, with carbon dioxide, the average surface temperature is about 15, now close to 16 degrees Celsius. So we have recognized that these particular chemicals play a very important role in terms of maintaining surface temperature. But to understand the current issues with regard to climate change, I think it's important to understand the variation between water vapor and carbon dioxide, particularly in regards to water vapor. If you look at the Earth as a whole, where on the Earth is it warm and humid? That is, there is a lot of water in the air. Well, the equatorial regions, of course, are the areas where we know it is warm and humid, where in essence, water vapor is the dominant greenhouse gas, and adding more carbon dioxide will cause the temperature to go up. but it will go up more slowly because of all the water vapor that's already in the air. It will dominate. Now ask yourself a slightly different question. Where on the Earth is water vapor low? That is, where is the air in the atmosphere dry? Doesn't have a lot of water vapor. Well, of course, if you look at the poles where the air is cold, there is not a lot of water vapor available. And so when carbon dioxide rises, we will see a greater change in temperature for the poles, right? Where else is the air dry? Well, of course, we know that in deserts, the air will be dry. And so in addition to seeing a greater change in temperature for the poles, we will also see a greater change in temperature for the deserts. That the temperature there will increase as a result of this disparity, this difference between water vapor and carbon dioxide. Now, this difference also can apply in terms of, so basically, let me just summarize. If water vapor is high, it's the dominant warming gas. And there is some effect, but less effect of carbon dioxide. But if the water vapor is low, where there isn't a lot of water in the air, where the air is dry, then adding more CO2 will increase the surface temperature disproportionately. And it is that difference in one area warming faster than the other area that can drive extreme weather events. So when you look at, for example, this is tropical storm and major hurricanes for the North Atlantic, based on data from the National Ocean and Atmospheric Administration. This is a 3-year running average. And you can see since 1970 that the number of storms have increased, but the intensity of the storms has also increased as a result of the warming ocean temperatures. And of course, when you see one area in terms of the number of storms, but also in terms of precipitation events, in other words, in areas that are already high in humidity, it's likely that you're going to see additional rainfall or additional precipitation occur in those areas. And this is for the United States. These are changes in the relative number of extreme events for heavy precipitation, which are defined as having within a 24-hour period rainfall of 5 to 6 centimeters. So it's a fairly large amount of rain occurring over a short time period. And as you can see over time, this has also increased. So we see one of the reasons why you should care about the rise in carbon dioxide is what it is doing in terms of surface temperatures. And additionally, why that change in surface temperatures with water vapor and carbon dioxide will differentially affect surface temperatures in terms of why some areas are warming faster than others and why that might in turn result in more extreme events. So in addition, we've talked about desertification, where the areas that are dry are going to become drier. So for example, throughout the 20th century, we've seen about a 10% increase in the extensification of the desert area within the Sahara. So areas that are dry are going to get warmer faster. They're changing in the size of the deserts that are going to occur. At the same time, you have areas that are warmer and wetter, and they're going to see more rainfall. But I'm going to add a second reason why you should care whether the carbon dioxide is 300 or 400 or 500 parts per million. And that is the role that carbon dioxide plays directly in terms of plant biology, in terms of plant growth. In a very basic way, we understand that there are resources that plants need in order to grow. And that's important because from a very basic level, plants provide all of the food, all of the energy for all living things, right? So they in turn depend on light. They depend on water. They depend on nutrients, phosphorus, potassium, and so forth. But they also depend on carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the source of carbon for all plant species. And about 95% of those species lack the optimal amounts of carbon dioxide they need in order to grow. So if any one of these resources changes, it's going to have a dramatic effect in terms of plant biology. In other words, it's going to dramatically affect the basis of the entire food chain for the planet. And I would argue that in addition to whatever it does to surface temperatures, that in and of itself is going to have a dramatic effect in terms of life as we know it. But is this a good thing? Is this something, if something makes plants grow more, that must be good, right? Well, in fact, it can be. Here's some basically a visualization of pictures showing for loblolly pine that as you give it more carbon dioxide, it's growing more. Not surprisingly, as I mentioned, about 95% of all plant species lack the optimal amounts of carbon dioxide, and as you give them more, they grow more. That must be good. Well, okay, if you're a forester and you grow trees for a living, you understand that the faster the tree grows, the weaker the wood, but okay, we'll set that aside for now. But we also recognize that not all plant species are beneficial to human society. Here is a picture of kudzu. Kudzu is a vine that came from Asia that is considered to be an invasive species within the United States. It takes over entire ecosystems. And it too also responds to carbon dioxide. It too also responds to temperature. So it isn't a question of just looking at the idea, well, CO2 is plant food, that must be good. It's more than that. It's understanding that not all plant species will respond the same way to a resource. And if they don't respond the same way to a resource, what are the ramifications of that for human systems? And particularly, of course, for agriculture. Because what happens if I add more carbon dioxide to a field? Does the crop grow more? Maybe. Do the weeds grow more? Oh yeah, almost certainly. So what does that mean in terms of food security? Well, when we look at food security, it's a little bit complex, but we understand that there has to be a supply. There has to be food. And from the field perspective, right? You have to have enough food in order to feed people. So production is important. But in more than that, it has to meet the dietary needs. It has to be nutritious. It has to be safe, and it has to be available. So let's look at it from the point of view of production for just a moment. Now, we understand that, of course, climate change is going to directly affect production in terms of its physical changes in rainfall, its physical changes in terms of temperature, potentially increasing droughts, etc. But it also is going to affect pest management, the biological constraints that occur with climate change, and those biological constraints that are going to also impact all of the biological issues that relate to pests. Now, let's look at pests in general. We know that in essence, you have pathogens, you have viruses, you have animal pests, you have weeds. Of all of those pests, weeds are the primary constraint in terms of production. We understand and have understood since agricultural began that weeds are the primary constraint in terms of achieving maximum production in a field level. So when you look at management, one of the things that is interesting to point out is that when you look at potential loss and actual loss of crops, here are the pathogens, here are the viruses, here are the animal pests. When I use management, I can bring this down, but I can bring it down the most in a weed situation. So it's our ability to manage weeds in a way that minimizes their impact that is so critical to maintaining food security and food production. So how is climate going to affect that? And that's what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about. Well, let's look at it from the point of view of production. We have herbicides, insecticides, fungicides. We understand that, particularly for developed countries, the main reason, our main ability to control pests is related to chemical means. We do not have the time or the resources to go out and physically remove the weeds in a 400-hectare farm. It just isn't possible. So we have chemicals that do this. And so when you look at the production of these chemicals in terms of US dollars, this is the herbicide issue here, insecticides, fungicides, and others. But of course, it's the herbicides that dominate our pest management strategy, and understandably so. As I've explained, weeds represent the major constraint in terms of production. So herbicides are the most common type of pesticides that are going to be used, and they account for almost 90% of the pesticides used by the agricultural sector. So let's focus for a moment on how climate change is going to affect the efficacy, the change in the use or the effectiveness of these particular chemicals. So as I mentioned, for developed countries, chemical control of pests is the primary means of management. Now here's data from the USGS, the United States Geological Survey, and this is for glyphosate use from 2012. I know it's a little out of date. Trust me, though, that the amount of glyphosate has not gone down appreciably. But you can see within the United States, particularly for the center of the United States, the primary agricultural areas, that this is where glyphosate is being used. And it's very, I think on the order of almost 1 billion pounds per year of glyphosate that's being applied. And you can see where the major agricultural production areas are for the United States. So here is just a breakdown of year and crop. I won't go through it, it's hard to see. But basically, particularly for corn and soy, a lot of glyphosate is used. It's the primary means of weed management. So it's not just for the US. If you go to the soybean production areas and Mato Grosso and other areas within South America, you're going to see a lot of soybeans. You're also going to see a lot of glyphosate and other pesticides that are applied in that context for this particular soy system within South America. So can changes in carbon dioxide affect herbicide efficacy? Now remember, carbon dioxide doesn't distinguish between the plant you want to grow and the plant that is competing against it. So here are some data looking for above ground biomass and seed yield for soybean in context of Canada thistle. Now, Canada thistle is a perennial weed. It is a weed that has really flourished as the management in the United States has switched to a no-till situation. So as we move to no-till or limited till, then perennial weeds tend to respond to that more than annual weeds. And so in many parts of the United States, this particular weed, Canada thistle shown here, has become more and more of an issue. So if we look at a 3-year study where we grew the soy and the Canada thistle under high and ambient carbon dioxide, in this case ambient CO2 are the open bars, the darker bars are ambient plus 300 parts per million CO2. And you can see that the above ground biomass, now this is with application of glyphosate. That's important. We added glyphosate as you would in a normal system. We apply glyphosate at the beginning of the year as a means to compensate for there not being any no-till. And what we found over time was that, in fact, under elevated CO2, that both the above ground biomass and the seed yield declined, even with glyphosate application. In essence, what we're seeing is that the amount of carbon dioxide in the air that we anticipate is promoting the growth of the weed relative to the crop. And even with the application of glyphosate, we are still seeing a greater effect of carbon dioxide on the weed. And as such, it is reducing the amount of yields for the soybean, significantly so. Why is it doing this? Well, we did a separate study looking at Canada thistle, shown here, and this is looking under ambient carbon dioxide. This is under future CO2, they get 300 parts per million more carbon dioxide, which we, by the way, anticipate based on different models, but we anticipate that this will occur prior to the end of the current century. And here, under ambient CO2, we applied glyphosate. We got about 85% control. We used the recommended dosage by the manufacturer. That's did what it was supposed to do. But when we grew it under elevated CO2, we didn't see that. In fact, we got zero control, even though we applied it at the rate that was recommended by the manufacturer. What's going on? What's happening here? Well, what we saw was that if you look at the ratio of biomass for the elevated carbon dioxide relative to the ambient, or a value of 1 means no effect, what we saw was this disproportionate effect of carbon dioxide on above ground and below ground biomass. So in fact, it was the root of Canada thistle that grew more when you gave it more carbon dioxide, not the shoot. And so what we saw over a 3-year period was that the roots of Canada thistle were stimulated more by additional carbon dioxide. And the reason why that's important, sorry, I'll go backwards here. The reason why that's important is that Canada thistle can reproduce asexually from parts of the root that have not been killed. So if you don't kill all of the root, it's going to come back. It's going to become a weed again. It's going to compete with soybean again. So it's important that when the plant is sprayed, all of the plant has to die in order for that spray to be effective. And what we see in the case of Canada thistle is that that did not occur. So is this true for other means, for other chemical management? It's not ubiquitous. It's not uniform across all things. We see different responses. And I have to update this. I apologize. It's about 5 years out of date. But in essence, if you look at the weed species here, if you look at the weed species here, and the photosynthetic pathway and the herbicide and the change in efficacy, there are some reports of it declining. There are some reports where there's no effect. So we cannot assume that the mechanism that we saw for Canada thistle is the same mechanism to explain a reduction in effectiveness for all other weeds. But it's clear, I think, that rising CO2 of and by itself, because of its ability to stimulate plant growth, because of its ability to change the chemistry, is going to have a differential impact or have an impact overall in terms of chemical efficacy, effectiveness of different herbicides. So what about climate per se, if we look at it from a climate point of view, or from an ecosystem point of view? So what we did, this was a fairly extensive experiment, but we took about 1/3 of an acre of land and we dug up the topsoil. We put the topsoil all together and then we redistributed it so that the weed seed bank would be the same. And then we put out these open top chambers, adding CO2 or not adding CO2 to see what that would do in terms of the demography of the different populations of the weeds that were in the soil. And what we found was that if we just grew up what was there in the soil, we didn't spray, and we looked at the different types of weeds that came up, there was an overwhelming effect of elevated CO2 on broadleaf weeds, particularly the C3 weeds. And just sort of background, C3 refers to a photosynthetic pathway that is not saturated at current CO2 levels, and it's represented by 90 to 95% of all plant species. C4 plants are adapted to the current level of carbon dioxide, and therefore adding additional carbon dioxide is going to have a minimal effect. That being said, so you can see when we did not spray with any additional herbicide, that it was the C3 broadleaf weeds that responded, as they should based on their photosynthetic chemistry. C4s did not respond very much. In fact, the broadleaf C4s did not respond much, but the grassy ones, the grassy C4s declined. If you go and now spray what we found was that because of this increase in biomass, basically we're not able to get rid of all of the C3 broadleaf weeds. So even with applications, and I think we did 2 applications here, we were not able to kill all of the C3 weeds that were present within this seed bank. So again, it's not just a question of a specific weed, but it's also going to affect weed populations, weed demographics, in terms of what kinds of weeds are likely to show up in the future as CO2 and or temperatures change. So to summarize, we see that increasing carbon dioxide can reduce the effectiveness of glyphosate, which is the most widely used herbicide in agriculture. The biological basis for this is still unclear. However, we see that for Canada thistle, it's likely to be associated with its differential effect of CO2 on root and shoot stimulation. I want to stop there and ask if there are any questions for the audience per se. Luis, do you have anything on chat or Q&A?
Yes, we have 2 questions. Dr. Nelson Cruz asks, in this context of pandemic and reduction in whole human activity, which lesson do you think is important to keep in mind in terms of climate change?
I think when you start looking at climate change through the lens of agriculture, that when we go into a new area that has not been disturbed and we remove the native vegetation and set up agriculture, that disturbs, in an ecological sense, all of the animals within that context. And that in turn can increase the interaction between animals and people in a way that might further any new pandemic. So by increasing animal to human interaction, then that in turn can have an effect with respect to future pandemics, because it affects the rate of zoonotic transfer between the animals that might be carrying a virus or a bacteria and the people that are in the villages around where the land is being developed now for agriculture.
Mm-hmm. There is a question from Leonid. The trend on herbicide use that you show in your presentation is the same in other parts of the world?
It's a good question. Actually, Luis, you might be better able to answer that than I, at least for Brazil. We're seeing it for the U.S. For glyphosate per se, and I'll show you some other work that we're doing in terms of temperature differences as well. But we have seen in some cases for other countries that there is a clear effect in terms of carbon dioxide in regard to selection and efficacy of the herbicide that can be dependent on the biotype of the weed that is involved. And Luis, would you say that's true?
Yeah,
or?
I think that's true. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We don't have any further question here.
All right, let me go on then. I want to look at another issue, and I think it's one that has relevance in terms of looking at the effect that GMOs or chemical mutants have. Can rising CO2 levels by themselves enhance gene flow between wild or weedy relatives of cultivated plants? And I want to point out that some of the worst weeds in agriculture are simply wild relatives of the crop that you're growing. So you have oat and wild oat, you have sorghum and shattercane, you have potatoes and other nightshades. We recognize that these are weeds that are really impactful because they often mimic what the crop is doing. They look just like the crop. And so it's hard to know if this is a weed or if this is the crop until, of course, much later when it becomes evident that they are different. So we understand too that a lot of these weeds have a low rate of outcrossing, but we also recognize that plants of the same species can outcross more. And there's a particular concern for transfer of GMO traits. So perhaps some of you have heard about, there was a time when they were looking for GMO sunflower. It was sunflower that you could spray with glyphosate. Makes sense, sunflower is a crop. But as someone pointed out, well, wild sunflower is no different genetically than regular sunflower. And so if you have GMO sunflower, can you in fact get that trait, that herbicide resistance trait, to show up in wild sunflower, which of course would defeat the purpose of doing GMO sunflower. So we wanted to look at this from a rice perspective. And in particular, if you look at, this is data from Smith and Weed Technology, it's old data, but it's also very pertinent data, because when you look at the loss in rice, in terms of which weed species has the most ability to reduce rice yields, of course, you're going to find those weeds that have similar phenology, similar requirements to the crop. So red rice is number one, barnyard grass, which looks like rice, is number two, and so forth. So the question that we had is, if these weeds that are similar to the crop are going to be differentially affected by carbon dioxide, does that change the rate of gene flow? And so in this case, we wanted to focus on Clearfield. Now, a little bit of background. Clearfield is a chemical mutant that confers tolerance to imazidine herbicides. Now, before this came to be, there were no effective options for controlling red rice in conventional rice. But there is recognized by agronomists and weed scientists that there's a small amount of outcrossing that occurs between red rice and cultivated rice. And the outcrossing is based on floral synchronicity. So if red rice flowers and your commercial rice flowers at the same time, then you're going to get more outcrossing. Now, fortunately, at this point, we recognize that red rice or weedy rice and cultivated rice flower at different times. So the degree of outcrossing is fairly minimal. So what we did is we wanted to ask the question, can recent, not just future changes in carbon dioxide, but have recent changes and projected increases, can they be a factor in gene flow between cultivated and wild rice? So we planted Clearfield, and we planted it with Stuttgart red rice biotype at a ratio of 7:1, where 7 of the Clearfield to 1 of the Stuttgart. And we did this for 3 different CO2 concentrations, 300, 400, and 600 parts per million. So basically, the change that's already occurred in carbon dioxide, the future change. And we asked, we did this in growth chambers, because you need a growth chamber to reduce carbon dioxide. It's very easy to add it, CO2 in experiments. It's much harder to reduce it. So we did this in growth chambers and sealed chambers where we could scrub the CO2. And then we took the seed from these chambers and we grew it out in the field. And you can see here, this is the 300 part per million seed, where Clearfield was the female growing here. And obviously you can see the weedy or red rice, it's the lighter green color throughout here. And this is 600 parts per million, same thing. Again, you're seeing the weedy rice showing up. And the Clearfield rice does cross at low rates with the red rice. And this produces a number of herbicide-resistant hybrids that we confirmed using DNA fingerprinting. Now, this work was done at Anna McClung's lab with Dave Geely, showing that really they did a phenomenal job in terms of these field trials. And what we saw was, this is just a relative change in some morphological parameters. So here's changes in height, changes in tiller number, changes in panicle number. And again, the Clearfield is the commercial line is the open bars. The red rice or weedy rice line is the hatch bars. And this is 300, 400, 500, or excuse me, 300, 400, 600 parts per million CO2. And you can see, I think, fairly clearly that it's the weedy rice that's responding more to the carbon dioxide change than the cultivated rice. And so as we increase the amount of carbon dioxide, we're seeing this differential effect in terms of the weed and the crop. And it's present. What's interesting, at least to me, is that it's not just present for future CO2 changes, but it's showing up even for recent changes in carbon dioxide. And so what I'm showing you here on these right side of the graph is just the difference between these two um, responses between the wild weedy line and the cultivated line as a function of CO2 are shown here. So there are obviously differences in morphological responses in regard to the tiller and panicles and so forth. But what was most interesting is the flowering times for red rice. So when you give red rice more carbon dioxide, it flowers earlier. And so that difference in flowering time between the weedy rice and the cultivated rice disappears. And as a result of that, then there's overlap between pollen production occurring between the cultivated and the wild or weedy rice. So what we saw was that the percent outcrossing and outcrosses per plot actually went up. So the CO2 concentration, percent outcrossing, the outcrossing was occurring from the wild weedy rice, which was taller than the commercial rice. And it was occurring in such a way that the domesticated rice became weedy. Not only did it become weedy, but it became resistant, herbicide resistance. So we were able to show that this change in carbon dioxide of and by itself, not just for future carbon dioxide, but for recent changes in carbon dioxide, was in fact affecting the ability to transfer, in this case, a chemical mutation for herbicide resistance, but is able to transfer that resistance as a function of rising carbon dioxide. So that was pretty cool. So the outcrossing increased from about 0.22% to 0.7% as CO2 rose from 3 to 600. Now, I know that's a small number, but in essence, it is a significant number in terms of how much more weedy rice can be formed under these conditions by this sort of outcrossing that can occur. And we know that the outcrossing was related to this closing of synchronicity and flowering between the weedy rice and the cultivated rice. It's associated with not only that, but of course plant height, increasing tiller number, panicle, and so forth. The direction of outcrossing was from the wild to the cultivated population, and this resulted in a number of increases in de-domestication, where the commercial rice, the domesticated rice, became wild as it received the pollen from the weedy rice. So that, in essence, the bottom line is you got a greater number of weedy herbicide-resistant hybrid progeny. So what are the ramifications of this? This was, as far as we know, was the first data to show that rising CO2 could facilitate gene transfer. There are obvious implications with respect to evolution and fitness. Okay, we've been focusing on carbon dioxide for the reasons that we've stated. It's important. It's a plant stimulates plant growth, and as I'm sure you've now learned, it doesn't stimulate the same degree of growth between weeds and crops, and there are going to be ramifications of that. But what are some of the other aspects of climate change that we might need to focus on here? Well, what about drought, and how would this influence weed control in rice? This is some data from 2013 for the US Drought Monitor, just showing the degree of drought throughout the United States, particularly for the high agricultural areas. But if you are putting as things dry out with climate, what influence does that have in turn of how culturally we've managed weeds and rice in the past? You control weeds and rice by flooding. Rice can grow in flooded conditions, many weeds cannot. But if we change the amount of water that's available, how does that affect our ability to control weeds through flooding in rice? Well, does that mean more direct seeding? Now we're seeing a lot of this happening, and greater herbicide use in rice. But if water sources are scarce in this context, what does a change in terms of direct seeded rice mean for herbicide resistance? Um, is there a synergy or potential synergy between rising CO2 and drought and spreading red rice? If there is this outcrossing or gene outcrossing that can occur, what does that mean in terms of the ability of red rice to become more of an issue, more of a problem for future climate? Are there other means of weed control? And this is some really interesting data. This is for Parthenium. I don't remember the author for this. It came out a couple of years ago, I think. But what's interesting about this is elevated CO2, 550, ambient carbon dioxide, 380. This is Parthenium, and you can see that, again, more carbon dioxide for Parthenium, bigger plant, but more seeds. That's important. And then they added an insect for biocontrol. And what's really interesting is that when you added the insect under elevated carbon dioxide, you actually got, you know, a bigger plant, but again, a faster and more rapid production of seed relative to ambient conditions. They didn't see a significant effect on biomass, but the seed output, they didn't measure, well, not in this paper. They did another paper on it showing that, in fact, seed output was much greater, and you can sort of tell that visually here at the elevated CO2 relative to the ambient CO2. So other means of looking at control besides chemical means in terms of cultural means for flooding or in terms of biocontrol, there may also be ramifications. There may also be consequences of climate change and carbon dioxide in terms of the efficacy of those means of control as well. Again, this is just touching the surface. This is just, you know, just a few little tantalizing hints that this could be changing. We need a lot more data and a lot more studies on this, but it's clear that climate per se, and certainly it's clear for carbon dioxide, is going to affect our ability to control weeds in the future. Let's look for a moment away from carbon dioxide in terms of management, and let's look at winter temperatures. Now, one of the things that you'll see in terms of demography, particularly weed demography, which populations of weeds and where they are and how they're doing, is very much going to be dependent on winters. And especially so that if the winter is cold enough, if it freezes, that has a major effect in terms of weed demography. When it's cold, you will limit the number of weeds that will be available. So we wanted to find out if, in fact, rising temperatures can affect pest pressures, or particularly not just weeds, but all pests. And we wanted to get a sense of not just for the future of what might happen, but what might be currently happening. So, of course, in the United States, we're a big country. We can go from a state like Minnesota, which is in the north, to a state that's further south in Louisiana, where it's warm, much warmer. And we can look at soybean, and since the mid-1990s, all the soybeans now are, of course, GMO, Roundup Ready soybean. So there's, you know, not a lot of management differences here. If you want to control weeds, you're going to spray with glyphosate across this transect. So by looking at this, one of the things we wanted to do was to see, okay, well, if pest pressures go up with warmer winters, and certainly the winters are much warmer in Louisiana than they are in Minnesota, then of course the yields must go down, right? Because greater pests, makes sense. So we looked at the minimum temperatures, and it gets very cold, as you imagine, in Minnesota, less so in Louisiana. But to our surprise, we did not see a difference in terms of metric tons per hectare for soybean. It was the same. This was data, I think, over a 10-year period. So, well, okay, yeah, the amount of hectares changes. It's slightly less in the southern states. This is weird though. What's going on there? The average soybean yields don't it seemed to be changing, even though there's clearly a change in minimum temperatures, and that should be a reflection of pest pressures. In other words, there should be fewer pests here where the winters are cold, and many more pests here where the winters are warm. But that didn't seem to be affecting yields. What's going on? Oh, wait a minute. Nope, sorry, I skipped a slide there. Oh, nope, I didn't skip a slide. What we found was, in fact, that as you went further south, you saw more pesticides being applied. So the reason why the yields did not decline was that farmers were using more pesticides, right? So that is and makes perfect sense that if pest pressures are high, you're going to use more chemicals in order to counter those pest pressures. So the reason why we think these numbers were not changing was in fact related to pesticide use, and those pesticides did go up dramatically. And I'm sorry, I thought I had a graph showing that, but this is data that's published in PLOS One from about 3 years ago. And if you're still curious, I'll send you the link for it. But yes, so we see that even though the overall temperatures are changing, that there's no effect in terms of yield, but that's due in part to because there's a greater amount of pesticides, greater amount of herbicides, greater amount of fungicides, greater amount of insecticides. It's across the board, not just for weeds per se. That being said, we recognize that chemical weed management is becoming problematic. The best way I can describe this, I think, is when glyphosate became the dominant herbicide, when everybody was just like spraying glyphosate and that was going to take care of everyone's problems, it's kind of like what doctors did when penicillin became available in the 1950s. They used penicillin for everything. And when you do that, of course, evolution is going to kick in because you're going to be selecting for resistance. And we saw penicillin resistance occurring by the 70s. Well, now we see it for glyphosate. It's been almost very dramatic. This is some work by Ian Heap, basically showing weeds have evolved resistance to 22 of the 25 known herbicide sites of action, up to 157 different herbicides. So herbicide-resistant weeds have been reported for 86 crops in 66 countries. Chemicals are good and you're going to need them, but you can't assume that one chemical is going to be a panacea, is going to solve all your problems, as we did with glyphosate. So now many of the companies are back to square one, and they're going back to some of the older lines or some of the older herbicides. And of course, there are risks with that, something like dicamba. Drift managed damaged farms and ecosystems. It's highly toxic to most broadleaf plants. Well, it doesn't distinguish for weeds again and soybeans. So we're seeing a lot of this drift happening, a lot of lawsuits that are being fostered as a result of this, and a lot of additional damage that is in fact occurring. So I'll try to give an overview here if I can in terms of how climate and carbon dioxide can affect chemical management. And so we'll talk about before you apply the herbicide, and we see that climate and CO2 can affect the weed distribution. They can affect weed demographics and population, and they can favor the weed over the crop at the time of herbicide application. So here is the normal situation. Here's the climate change situation. Bigger crops, higher weed pressures, perhaps a more diverse number of weeds that are present in the field. Excuse me. And then during application of the chemical herbicide, you can see extreme events in terms of weather that are associated with climate change that may in turn affect your efficacy or your ability to distribute the herbicide in the field situation, and that changes in wind and rain are going to influence spray patterns and retention times. And then finally, after the herbicide has been applied, there are changes in CO2 morphology. We talked about Canada thistle, the shoot root changes that might affect the efficacy. And in addition, climate and carbon dioxide can reduce things like leaf protein levels and basically can affect the chemistry of the plant, the biochemistry of the plant in such a way that it may have less of an effect, or potentially it could have more of an effect depending on what specific mechanism is impacted by temperature and or carbon dioxide. So those are all the sort of broad-based overview of this. So before I go on to the next segment, I'm going to stop there and ask if there are any questions on this last segment.
Is there any question? I didn't receive any questions so far.
Okay.
So
all right, we'll go on.
Mm-hmm.
How do you respond to this? Okay, if these changes are happening and we're seeing glimpses, right, that this is going on, how do you respond? What should we do differently? And I'm going to offer you my own personal sort of ideas on this. And this is not, you know, you're welcome. This is not inclusive by any means. There are a lot of different ways to approach it. But I'm going to try and do what I call the 3 M's. And the first M is monitoring. So we, back in the day in the United States, monitored very closely everything that was happening in the Soviet Union and in other places in the world. We had to keep track of weapons of mass destruction, right? Spent billions, probably trillions of dollars doing this. Now, I would argue that this is also important in the context of pests. Pests like pine bark beetles, which are destroyed in North America over 35 million acres. It's clear that there's a climate signal associated with this, that as temperatures are warming, the beetles are moving into different areas. We need to monitor them. We need to keep track of them, because I would argue that just like missiles, they're weapons of mass destruction. So in terms of monitoring, how do we do that? Gosh, I don't know. How about if we had some sort of portable handheld device that we could take with us, put, you know, next to our ears, and be able to, I don't know, take pictures with it and share those pictures with others that, you know, would then allow them to get some sort of sense of, I don't know, some new weed that was showing up in an area that hadn't been seen before. And, oh, wow, gosh, I don't know, maybe this could be something that we could exchange globally. And hey, even some major, you know, chemical company could sponsor such a website as a means to, you know, keep track of all that. And we're not doing that. Now, granted, we are doing it for some countries, and we are doing it for, you know, certain regions. But in the case of pine bark beetle, it could be moving all the way through Canada, but we and Canada don't share information on where the distribution of pine bark beetle is. That doesn't make sense to me. If you want to know where your enemy is, whether it's an insect or a weed or a virus, they do it in terms of medical issues. If I want to know where COVID is going to be, I keep track and the data are being exchanged. But if I want to know where a new pathogen might be for my soybean, not so much. And that has to change. So in addition to monitor, we need to mitigate. And this is not new science by any stretch of the imagination. We often rely on what we refer to as a early detection, rapid response paradigm. So we recognize that it's very, very important to detect here, because when you detect there, you can get something like this noted and eradicated. But when it gets to this point over time, it's almost impossible to take care of it. And so this is kudzu, and here's kudzu after it had a chance to proliferate. It is much easier to take care of it when it is this size it is almost impossible to take care of it when it gets to this point. So early detection in terms of mitigation is incredibly important. And often we don't do a good enough job of that. There are opportunities, particularly IT and technological opportunities to do so, perhaps remote sensing, perhaps again using this sort of handheld cell phone type app that might be useful, but we're not there yet. And finally, talking about management. This is an oldie but a goodie, as they like to say. This is something that's been around for a while, but kind of got put on the shelf when glyphosate became available, because everybody went to glyphosate and there was no need to worry about anything anymore. But I would argue that the kind of integrated pest management that we have used in the past, where we have a lot of tools in our toolbox, where you monitor the pest, you determine whether the pest is an issue, you use for alternative means of control, and then if none of this, if it meets all the criteria, then you use chemical management, is a way of selection that will arguably reduce the degree of resistance that is going to occur. You have to know what those tools are, you have to know how to use them, but especially have to know how to use them in the context of a changing climate. So how do we integrate existing IPM methods to assess emerging climate-driven changes in our pest demography, or how do we use it in a way that will allow us to take the information that we have in terms of how things like carbon dioxide and temperature are altering efficacy and respond to that change, so that we can begin to use this as an effective tool moving forward. So in terms of looking at it from weed management implications, we see again that rising CO2 can reduce herbicide efficacy. I think there's enough information out there, not just from my lab, but from others, that's certainly going to happen. We see that the basis for that reduction can be species specific. I'm not saying that's a one-size-fits-all model, but there's a lot more we need to know. But I think there's enough information to indicate that that can occur. There's less known regarding the impact of climate and/or carbon dioxide on other means of weed or pest control. How does it affect biocontrol, for example, as we showed in that one slide for Parthenium? A lot of that we don't understand, but it's clear that there's, again, there's just a little bit of information that suggests that it's going to be an impact. And then again, from a biological point of view, there's a lot of things going on in terms of carbon dioxide and temperature that are just going to affect basic aspects of pest biology, gene transfer in terms of fitness, evolutionary fitness, in terms of distribution. And it's important that we begin to understand what these impacts are going to be and prepare for them. In some ways, COVID and climate change are similar in that we knew that a pandemic was going to occur. We knew it. It was no question. We prepared for it. We tried to. And then we find that when it does occur, nothing. We're scrambling all over the place. In the case of climate change, we have known for decades that it is happening. We need to learn from our COVID response and prepare better in terms of our response to climate change, particularly from a food security, from a biological constraint point of view. So some final thoughts on management. Monitor, the 3 M's, monitor, mitigate, manage. Monitor, forewarned is forearmed. The past is no longer prologue. You need to know what your enemy is. You need to know what pests are going to be more of an issue with climate than you have in the past. In terms of mitigation, you need to be proactive rather than reactive. You need to be in front of the problem and to recognize how climate and carbon dioxide are going to affect the problem. And finally, in terms of management, it can't be just simply referring to a spray or to a chemical means for management. yes, you still have to use chemical means, no question. But it has to be beyond that. There has to be other ways to approach the problem where you're not going to just immediately go to a chemical means to control a pest, that there are other ways to begin to approach this in an integrative way, but particularly in an integrative way that takes into account climate change, whether that result of climate change is a change in the demographics so that the weeds that you've fought in the past are not the weeds in the future, or whether it's a change in herbicide efficacy, or whether it's a change in demography in terms of what plants and crops and weed associations are occurring. But you have to consider that. And I don't think that in the current mindset of many weed scientists and many agronomists that we're quite there yet. I hope that we will be going forward. So this is by no means an end to the story. The story is going on. There are still new and exciting research that's happening. Dr. Avila is doing some of this work. I think is really fascinating. I think some of you perhaps that are listening are doing similar work. There's so much more we need to know in this regard, so much more. So I'm hoping that if nothing else, this particular presentation is like a bookmark. It's a way of sort of seeing where we are at the moment, but it is not a final end to our story. The story is still going on. So anyway, thank you so much for your attention, and I'd be happy to address any questions that you might have.
Dr. Ziska, I have a question. First of all, thank you for your presentation. Was excellent. We have been working together for the last 6 years. We have collaboration. You have been collaborating to our group and helping our students and help to train them. And this seminar series is about training the next generation of weed scientists. And you have been sharing our expertise on climate change to our students and to our group. And we are very pleased for that. Knowing Brazil and knowing South America and several places in the world, what do you think is the expertise that a master or a PhD student in weed science and or crop science need to know and need to get information to face the climate change? What are the information and what type of research they should be doing?
I think the answer to that lies in looking at the current means by which agriculture is managed. So for example, if we know that Mato Grosso is a major area for soybean production. What are the on-the-ground type management issues that are currently being faced in Mato Grosso, particularly in terms of the number of pesticides that are using? Which pesticides are being reduced in terms of their efficacy? Why are they being reduced? What's happening to the climate? What's happening to the management and as a means? Because when we talk about weed science in this context, we want to look at the future. We want to understand the theory. But I think the way to appeal to get the resources that you need to address these issues is to look first at what is actually happening in the field. What are the both short-term and long-term consequences? Once you have that information, then you can begin to look at ways in which to compensate, ways in which to adapt, ways in which to mitigate. So I think that's number one. Number two is, in that context, what I have seen so far is that you have to focus on diversity. The old set of ideas that everything had to be a monoculture, everything had to be based on I'm going to grow this kind of soybean and I'm going to grow it forever and ever, amen, because that's where I'm making all my money on. I think you'll find that that's starting to change. And I think that one of the reasons why it's starting to change is pest pressures, and that climate and carbon dioxide are going to accentuate those pressures. You can bring in the public health context because we know that pesticides have a public health consequence. How can we take the current set of instructions and begin to modify that in a way that is beneficial both from the agronomic perspective, from the production perspective, but also from the public health realm? So looking at diversity, looking at management, and then the final issue, I think, is looking at it from a genetics point of view, an evolutionary point of view, if you will, so that when you begin to apply some of these pesticides, how is that affecting evolutionary fitness? When you begin to address that in the context of different varieties of soy, ask yourself, is that variety going to be the best variety to grow in the future in terms of adapting to or mitigating climate change? How do I change my management practices? How do I change my genetic selection issues to compensate or to adapt to what we see both in terms of climate and carbon dioxide? So I think if you can do those in the context of a reality-based assessment of vulnerabilities in the current management scheme, in the context of future changes, and in the context of specific and theoretical issues, I think you can do quite a bit.
We don't have any more question, and I would like to thank you very much for your presentation. Again, thank you for your help.
Sorry to interrupt, Luis. I see one question on.
Yeah, there is another one here.
It says, considering environment implications, herbicide use and availability of labor in developing countries such as Mozambique, what are your comments on this? I think that when you start to look at management, diversity is important in the sense that you don't want to rely too much on a single strategy. And so we talked about this in the context of IPM, but I think it's even more relevant for climate change. So if I have labor intensification, I would want to use that depending on the size of the farm and the efficacy of that. So if I have a small farm and I have the labor available, then I would use that as a means for weed control or pest control. At the same time, I would want to take a lot of the IT and the social services, the Facebook and the chats and the pictures and so forth, and to begin to set up a platform where I could share that with neighboring farmers, so that if, for example, I saw a Parthenium weed, I would be able to point this out and say, hey, this is something that we need to keep an eye on for the neighborhood. Are other people seeing it? Share that information. With 2/3 or 3/4 of the world having a cell phone now, there's no reason not to do that. At the same time, recognizing that if the problem gets out of control and there's no other means to begin to use it, to go back to herbicides or pesticides as a means to control it. So again, not using or relying on a single strategy, but using whatever is available in terms of tools that fit the circumstances by which the pest occurs. So not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't see the.
No, I did. I saw it just now.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ziska. It was very good to hear you. It was very good to see you, and I wish you all the best.
See you. Thank you. Everyone take care. Stay safe.
Stay safe. Bye-bye.